Let's review a little bit of what we were talking about until now. So we introduced with these two verses. ועבדתם את השם אלוקיכם, וברך את לחמך ואת מימך, והסירותי מחלה מקרבך, and that you shall serve God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will remove sickness from your midst. And then lo tiyeh meshakela v'akara be'asecha et mispar yamecha amaleh. No woman shall miscarry or be barren, and I will, or miscarry, it's technically speaking, it's be bereaved or be barren. I will let you enjoy the full count of your days. And then we explained that the words lo tiyeh can either mean as a promise, there will not be, or as an instruction that you shall not be such a person. So in order to understand that, we got into the whole idea of service of God, that what exactly is the service of God? We wanted to know what's the concept of avodah, and we asked the question, basically, how do we even use the term avodah with regards to God? Because God doesn't need any service. On the other hand, a physical master, of course, does need something. He does need somebody to provide him with something that he lacks. On the other hand, God doesn't lack anything. So we wanted to understand this whole idea. Does our service impact God? And in order to answer that, we said, actually, it's not just a simple yes or no. There are different opinions. There's one opinion that actually comes from a verse that basically nothing that we can do can touch God. God's completely beyond all of our anything that we do, whether positive or negative. On the other hand, we do find certain verses that insinuate that we can expand God's power, whatever that means, or quote unquote weaken God's power. So we needed to understand what that means. And that's what we're going to give a little bit of a dive into a Kabbalistic idea. And we're going to quote from a 16th century Kabbalistic work called Avodat HaKodesh. It was written by Rabbi Meir Ibn Gabbai, who was a Spanish sage, and this is a major Kabbalistic work. And he writes the answer to this question in typically cryptic style. And we're going to analyze his explanation and to be able to understand what different levels of divinity are each of these different opinions referring to. So let's give a background to this idea first, because we really want to understand, before we start looking at the texts, we want to understand what the ideas we're talking about. So Kabbalah, generally speaking, expands on the relationship between us and God. Not just the personal relationship, but also with regards to creation in general. So Kabbalah talks about the idea that the journey from God's infinity into a finite world needs to go through a process. Now, this is not a direct process like you might see in chemistry, where certain solutions co-join, and as a result of their molecular structure, they react in a particular way immediately. But there's actually, in order to be able to divide up the elements, we need to point out that there's the infinite element of this conversation and the finite, okay? The infinite element is that which we refer to as above Hishtalshalut. Hishtalshalut is a word which means the chain of emanations, or the chain reaction which creates the world. And that refers to a specific system in which God goes, like the chemical reaction, step after step after step. One thing causes the next. Chain reaction, cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect. Above Ishtalshalut is something that is beyond that kind of system, because of the fact that in order to be able to have a cause and effect, you have to have a relationship between both the cause and the effect. So that which is above Ishtalshalut, we're going to talk about the idea as it is beyond, and God himself needs to use a certain mechanism in order to be able to bridge that, which is generally speaking referred to as the idea of tzimtzum, which means contraction. God, so to speak, contracts his energy into a very focused energy, and this creates a brand new system. Now, that concept of contraction is a very, very deep and important one, but we're not going to focus on it here. Here, we're going to focus just in general on the two ideas of that which is beyond Ishtalshelus, and the different levels of things that are beyond, and that is within Ishtalshelus and the systems as they are within. Those are the two realms that we're going to be dealing with, or dimensions that we're going to be dealing with. The difference between the two of them in general, because again, we're talking about pretty deep ideas. I guess we've got a question here. Go ahead.
Yes. When you say God contracts his energy, can you please explain the word contracts?
Okay, absolutely. Well, like I said, we can't get completely into this because this is a very, very...
And just give me a small idea.
Exactly. So when you have, the way the Kabbalists describe it, you have the decision to create the world itself creates what we refer to as light. Okay? Now, this is not physical light, but it has similar properties.
Are you talking about divine light?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
It has similar properties to light, and it has similar properties to energy. And so those two words are used in certain contexts in order to be able to describe what this is.
Okay.
The properties similar to light are, for example, just the same as light. You have a luminary that spreads the light, but the light is always connected to the source. And as soon as you disconnect from the source, it doesn't exist anymore. So all of creation has that element. But in this infinite stage, it's not focused. It includes anything, any possibility, any property that possibly could be in existence.
Okay.
So this process of contraction is to take one ray, so to speak, of that light and focus that downwards. That separation of one ray causes what's referred to in Kabbalah as an empty space. And that empty space is now filled with the energy of this singular ray, which causes there to be finite space, finite energies, finite light, and now you have a different system. Is that understood?
Yes, I get it.
So we're going to talk about this concept of light, but we're going to talk about also the conduit through which the light gets focused into our world. And that's referred to as these two opposite sides, orot and kalim. Kalim means receptacles, vessels. And let's give a very, very physical explanation to this entire concept. You have the electrical grid. The electrical grid, of course, feeds power into the substations. The electrical grid follows and into the substations. The substations follow the electrical energy into our houses. And then into our houses, we have the decision, whatever we want, to plug into the outlet, either a light bulb or a computer or a printer or a toaster, okay? That energy, of course, can be used in any electrical appliance. From the energy's perspective, it doesn't care what it's being used for. It's just an energy. It's colorless, it's tasteless, it has no properties besides for providing the energy into whatever I plug into the wall. On the other side of things, though, is the receptacle. The receptacle is very, very specific. If I want to burn my bread for breakfast, I do so using a toaster. I don't do so using my laptop. And very, very different, of course, in terms of the receptacle. So the same thing with regards to God's energy. God's energy itself, or light, the orot as we're referring to, the light here is something which is colorless, tasteless, it's beyond, but it gets fed specifically into a receptacle, which is the means through which we receive that energy. those kalim, those receptacles, are what are referred to as the sfirot, the attributes or the emotional energies or intellectual energies. Chesed is kindness. Gevura is typically translated as strength, but the idea is not actually strength. It's actually either withholding or discipline. Tiferet means beauty, which is basically a co-joining of both of those into a new space of compassion. And so the way God relates to us is through these different kalim, as his energy is focused into them. And that's all within the world of Hishtalshalut, because Hishtalshalut is, again, this chain of reaction, and in which we actually take up space, we make an impact, we are involved, the things that we do create this relationship. So for example, and we're going to mention this a little bit later on, so for example, when we give tzedakah, we are fulfilling God's commandment in a way of chesed, in a way of kindness. And so therefore, we complete or strengthen or create a vessel to be able to receive God's kindness. And so therefore, God's energy can be focused into us in that particular way. If we refuse to do a mitzvah, or we do it in a way that's negative, in other words, we do it for self-grandeur, or we do it in a way in which we're upset that we're doing it, when we don't put the full energy into it, or whatever, those kinds of things, we can create that receptacle to be able to receive that energy, to be able to receive the relationship, but it's a weakened vessel or it's a defective vessel. The wires can be crossed. The wires within the computer can simply not be functioning properly. And so therefore, my toaster can create a short, or it will work some of the time, it won't work all the time, etc. So that's the difference between orot and kelim. Orot are on the bigger scale of things when you're talking about the electrical grid, the electrical energy itself, which is not concerned so much with what's going on at the end user. On the other end, the kelim is that which we receive and that which, how we interact, how we can use that energy in our personal lives. So that's the concept in general. Then afterwards, we're going to go into something a little bit more specific, but let's stick to this right now. If there are any questions, we can answer any questions, but otherwise we'll go into the text. Okay. So the text, the Kabbalistic text, Avodat HaKodesh, resolves this contradiction with the cryptic statement. Again, Avodat HaKodesh was written by Rabbi Meir ben Gabbai, a Spanish rabbi who, I think he was born in 1480. He passed away in the 1540s, if I remember correctly. So he writes, that which the sages say doesn't matter to God, in other words, like, does God really care, refers to the singular master, source of all sources. To him, it truly does not matter. However, for the purpose of bestowing glory upon the supernal heads, to unite the beginning of thought with its end, there is certainly a purpose. Now, for those of us who are standard Jews, this is a statement which really doesn't make very much sense, and therefore we're not Kabbalists. So the Rebbe expands this idea and explains what we're talking about here. He says what this means is that avodah does not matter on the level of the source of sources, but only when it reaches down into the chain of creation known as Hishtalshalut, beginning with the level of Chachma, and even higher than that on the level of Keter, the level of Arich, which is the source of emanations. However, avodah does not impact the inner dimension of Keter, the level of Atik. So he just explained it in a general concept without expanding it. In just a moment, we're going to expand it a little bit more. Here he uses more specific terms, and just to introduce the specific terms that he used, we already discussed the idea of that which is beyond Hishtalshalut and within Hishtalshalut. Now I'm going to give you specific names. Beyond Hishtalshalut has a term called Keter. Keter itself has two dimensions, atik and arich. Arich in general, within the human system, these are referred to as will and desire. Will, our drive to do something, and we're not talking about on a simplistic level, but we're talking about the deepest level of the human being. Not like, oh, I think I want a coffee right now, but something much deeper. The desire to accomplish, the desire to be, the desire to be connected, all of those kinds of elements on the deepest elements of our psyche. So desire is driven by that inner pleasure. So again, we're not talking about taste here. We're not talking about sound, the physical senses, but we're talking about the inner systems of desire, the inner systems of pleasure. The difference between the two of them is that desire is very focused and is basically a general concept, but needs to be focused into something very specific. Whereas pleasure can be general and it's not specific at all. A person can have tremendous pleasure from seeing his children interact with each other. Is that pleasure which is relevant to your arm, to your head, to your knee? Obviously, it's not specific to any of those particular systems. It's a general pleasure which encompasses all of yourself as you enjoy what your children are doing or what was just accomplished. And so therefore, that level of pleasure is truly beyond. Whereas the desire is very, very focused. If I'm a musician, then I'm very interested and very focused on, let's say, my fingers and how my fingers express the music. And so it's very, very specific, or it can be focused in something very, very specific. And so therefore, the level of atik, which is the inner level of keter, we're going to see is the source of all sources, is that which is truly beyond, whereas the level of will is beyond, but then becomes focused within as it's translated into our world. So again, a very deep idea, but we're going to see the same concept as it refers to in God's creation. So those both are above Ishtalshalut, but Arich is above but relevant and relative to. Atik is above completely. There's no relationship whatsoever. We can talk about something that's out of this world, but relevant. So, of course, the International Space Station is out of this world, but it's relative to our world. We have human beings there. But on the other hand, if we're talking about several galaxies away, we're talking about something that's completely beyond, that has no relativity to where we are. And that's in a spatial manner. Here we're talking about in a much deeper psychiatric, as well as, on this, in terms of here, we're talking about dimensional level, where there are different dimensions of divinity. Obviously, the intensity is far greater on the higher and the deeper you go. So that's where we're going to now that we've looked at the idea in general, let's look at specifically. Again, we need to take these very, very abstract concepts and apply them to ourselves. That's really the point of Chassidic philosophy, is not just allow the Kabbalistic ideas to be there and to say, okay, these are academic ideas, but to be able to draw them down into ourselves and to be able to understand the systems at work so that it's more relevant to us. So the Rebbe continues and he says, to get a better understanding of this, let's see how Avodah impacts both the divine light and energy and the receptacles for that light, the Orot and the Kelim. The whole idea of the Kelim is that they conceal the divine light and energy, and this creates a space for there to be otherness. Okay, so what this means is basically God by himself, of course, nothing else exists outside of God. Nothing can exist outside of God. But through creating the system of Orot, focusing his energy, and then kalim, receptacles, to be able to receive it, God has now created a system in which there is something else to receive his energy. So the purpose of the kalim, the purpose of the receptacle, is to focus that energy in a particular way, to conceal it so that it comes out in a particular form. So the energy, the electrical flow, goes into the computer, and the result is I have words on my screen. Okay? And the Rebbe continues, this is because when the light shines by itself, all that is revealed is the source. If you look directly in the sun, the light is there, but all you can absorb is the sun itself. And of course, that is too powerful for us to be able to, for our eyes to be able to even handle. And likewise, with regards to this, the analogy of God's energy. Through the kalim containing and concealing the light, space is made for the existence of otherness, and through a downward chain of effect, that which we referred to before as ishtalshalut, eventually even separate beings can be created. So because the whole idea of kalim is otherness, it is perfectly sensible to say that avodah clearly impacts the kalim. In other words, through one's lack of avodah, a defect is caused in the kalim. So because the purpose of the kalim is for the end user, so therefore it is understood that through our avodah, through the end user's behavior, we can create a defect in the kalim, in the receptacle of God's energy. How is that so far? Any questions so far?
Really?
Sure.
You're saying you're talking about various levels of the sefirot. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the kalim, we're the kalim, and the orot we're affected by the orot from the light through our avodah, right?
Okay.
Okay. Is this
Yes.
what we're trying to get to? I'm trying to understand this a little bit more.
So what we're trying to understand is, does our avodah impact God?
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're explaining now is that on the lowest of levels, on the end user level, we see that it clearly, without question, impacts the kalim, our end user experience. Because the kalim is that which God creates in order for us to be able to absorb that energy, in order to be able to use that energy, use the relationship, so to speak.
But the light affects each level of the sefirot.
That's correct. So the
Chesed,
sefirot,
Gevura,
let's explain this.
Keter.
Let's explain this with regards to the actual term sefira. So each sefira is made up of the energy that goes into the keli, into the receptacle, and it comes out in a particular way. The analogy that's given to this is if you put water in different cups that have different colors. Mm-hmm. So the water will reflect or look a certain color based on the cups. The same thing with regards to the sefirot. The sefirot are an energy which is fed into a particular receptacle, and it comes out in such a way that we see chesed, we see kindness, we see gvura, we see discipline, we see tiferet, we see netzach, hod yisod, or we see chachma or bina, or whatever it is. Now the energy itself is colorless and doesn't have a specific relationship with each one of these specific receptacles.
So it's like a prism, in other words, where the light.
Yes. The contracting of the light is going into the prism. The way the light comes out is the sefirot themselves.
I see.
Okay.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So we see clearly that there's no question whatsoever that our avodah can impact the kalim, because the kalim were created for us. It's just that simple. But now the Rebbe wants to take it up one step higher. Okay? Our avodah also impacts the orot themselves. And how is that? The question is, we just explained that the electrical flow, so to speak, is not impacted by the end user. We can't change the actual energy itself. It's just a question of how we channel it. How would God's energy be impacted by what we do? And the Rebbe explains something very important. We need to be able to look at things more than just skin deep. We need to look at things on a much deeper level, and that's where we're going. The Rebbe explains, but the truth is that avodah even directly impacts the arot, the divine light and energy. It is true that a defect cannot be made in the arot, only in the kelim. However, as a result of the defect in the kelim, the arot withdraw from the kelim. Thus, considering that the fact that the purpose of the light is to shine within the context of the kelim, the very purpose of the divine light is not completed. Therefore, one's fulfillment or lack of avodah even impacts the arot. And God shines the energy in order for us to receive. And if we are not allowing ourselves to receive the arot are impacted not because a defect is caused in the arot, but something deeper. The purpose of the arot is not being used out. So therefore, the impact goes back even to the arot, because the arot themselves are meant for a purpose. They're meant to go into a certain place. You know, your 5-year-old kid takes the food that you made and dumps it on the floor. Then your purpose of feeding the child has not been accomplished, and so therefore you get frustrated. Okay, so we understand now that a defect can only be created in the kelim. However, the relationship between us and God is impacted on the level of the arot, because God wants us to be able to receive that energy. And when we do not do avodah properly, we cause those arot not to be able to be focused in a proper manner into us. So that's a second level of the impact. Now we're going to take a step up. We explained that there's the levels of within Ishtalshalut, and that's within the chain of reaction that creates the world. That we understand so far. But now on the next level, it's going to take an even deeper level. Go ahead, what's the question?
My question is, if we don't do avodah properly, we create a defect. If we don't do it properly.
That's correct. Go ahead.
In other words, if I don't practice Judaism the proper way, I create the defect.
So this idea of avodah is very, very much dependent on where a person is and their service of God. Okay? Because none of us practice Judaism perfectly. God didn't create a world in which we are capable of fulfilling Judaism perfectly. We need to be able to fulfill Judaism as perfectly as we are capable, each one of us individually.
Okay.
And so our avodah is very much dependent on where we are, what our circumstances, what our knowledge base is, what our concerns, are, and all that kind of thing. So yes, there is an ideal that we're going to talk about soon, but you'll see that the Rebbe knocks down the ideal Jew, so to speak. He says, we're going to kind of trash the ideal religious Jew in a few chapters. It's an interesting construct because of the fact that you typically build up a picture that is this kind of perfect image, and the Rebbe says that actually that perfect image is actually very, very much flawed. And it's very, very interesting how we're going to look at that. This is one of the things I love about this, because this is absolutely not stereotypical. This is avodah is very much where a person is and the energy in which a person is capable of putting into the relationship with God. And this is the reason why, for example, the Baal Shem Tov loved what he referred to as the simple Jew as opposed to the scholars, because the scholars are oftentimes so complex and so full of themselves that they completely neglect this. On the other hand, the average person is oftentimes much more focused on and intuitively relates to God on a very, very deep and basic level, as opposed to a complex and beyond level. So yes, we need to do as much as we possibly can, but it very much is dependent on the person's unique circumstances.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Excellent question. I'm glad you brought that up. Now, but even beyond this, back to the text, one's avodah even impacts the level of the orot as they are above the state of being invested into the kelim. And at this point, we're going to finish this paragraph, and we're not going to be able to go further because we're already running up on our half-hour limit. For the light on that level is a direct feeder source to the lights that will go into the receptacles. And it's for that reason that avodah even impacts the level of arich, because arich is the source of emanation. Since avodah impacts the emanations, the kelim, therefore the source is impacted as well. So basically we explained that there's this contraction experience. And there's the feeder of that single line, that single ray into the dimensions of Yishtalshalus. At that point, there's still an impact because there's a purpose for that emanation. There's a purpose for that feeder, and that purpose is still, even though it's truly beyond, but it's still connected to, because purpose has a direct relativity. And so on that level, there's still an impact in terms of what we do. However, Avodat HaKodesh said the source of all sources is not impacted, and that is the level of Atik. That is the inner level of Keter. And on that level, we do not impact God because that is a source of sources, which is truly beyond, and there's no relevance to the lower levels at that point. It's truly totally beyond. And that's the next paragraph. That's what we're going to say in the next paragraph. And through that, we're able to understand that the two opinions are talking about two levels of the divine. That's where, as far as we can go right now. Into the future, we're going to say, actually, there's an even deeper level. And the Rebbe goes beyond Avodat HaKodesh and says, okay, we're going to go much deeper. And for that, we're going to have to wait until, God willing, our next class is when, Rabbi Smith?
I believe Wednesday, right? Wednesday and Friday?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions just before I sign off here?
Thank you for answering the questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's a deep idea, and I hope that everybody, if you kind of go through it, review it, I hope it'll maintain some clarity. But any questions, please either shoot me an email, rabbi.estrin@gmail.com, or you can ask me next time. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everybody.
Have a great Shabbos, Rebbe.